It gives me tremendous pleasure, and it's a great honour to introduce Professor Gregg at this reception for his book that's just come out. This is only my fourth. My name's Alexander Key. I'm an assistant professor of Arabic and comparative literature here, and one of the most junior members of the Comparative Studies program that Bob used to lead. So this is only my fourth year here, so there's a degree to which I'm kind of so far behind Bob that I can scarcely see him anymore as he retreats with this substantial achievement. I'll just give you most of you already know this, but this is stuff that I've more recently learned, a quick rundown of the highlights of sort of his career highlights. So there was tenure at Duke, in working as a professor of Christianity. Then he was the first director of the Abbasi program in Islamic studies here at Stanford from 2005 to 2009. There was a Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching, Lifetime Achievements in Teaching here at Stanford. Professor in the Religious Studies Department, and also the Dean of Memorial Church and the Dean for Religious Life here at Stanford between 1987 and 1989. The book that we're all here to celebrate, which is this achievement of like encapsulating something that people often talk about and allude to, but never really have the facts and the professionally laid out stories next to each other. So it's a remark that people often make, not least both in interfaith and in academic conversations, that there are these connections between the stories. There are these stories with the prophets, and there are these connections, but we tend to sort of leave it as that, as a field. People sort of alluded to the connections without doing the job of putting them all together. So what we have here in shared stories, rival tellings, early encounters of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, is an examination of how the three religions, scriptural interpreters, developed distinct understandings of five narratives: Cain and Abel, Sarah and Hagar, Joseph, Jonah, and Mary. Again, when people have these conversations in the field, they don't tend to have all five of those stories at their fingertips. People make little remarks to each other that there may be some little connections. But I think that after this book, given a few years, people are going to be able to refer to this as a resource, both in teaching and in academic work. And this is somewhere you can go to find this information. And I'm going to leave you with a review by Professor Mira Balberg that makes a point, I think, particularly important from the academic perspective, and the kind of tendency of academia to take stories like this away from people and pull them into academia. Mira Balberg says that it's evident, and in her view praiseworthy, that the cultural capital category with which Gregg thinks is storytelling rather than hermeneutics. So despite the fact that so many of these works are interpretative in nature, and several are also formally structured and presented as commentaries, Gregg avoids constructing a direct hierarchical relationship between canonical text and exegetical works, and instead, which is what I think you could make a fair case to say that people in Islamic studies have tended to do, and instead he presents the artists and the authors discussed in the book as creative agents who reinvent stories and make them their and their community's own. I think Professor Balberg got it right. Thank you for giving me tremendous privilege to introduce Professor Gregg.
Thank you for coming. I want to begin by thanking Burchak for organizing this event, and for Alex to pulling together into a coherent form what this thing tries to do. I also want to start by noticing that sitting against the back wall Well, I regard all of you, even if I don't know you deeply, as supporters of my enterprise, so I'm really grateful that you came today. Will Sherman, sitting in the back, was one of the students in a class that I used to teach called Three Sacred Stories in Three Different Traditions, when I was trying to figure out what this project was going to be. So we've known each other for a lot of years because this thing has been a lot of years in the making. I want to thank Mary Lane, my spouse, who's been supportive from the, well, first of all, when I was at the Hopkins Marine Station Library trying to finish a different book, the people there asked me to give a talk to all the scientists and people associated with Hopkins Marine Station. And I thought, I'm working in this library next to shelves that say stalk-eyed crustaceans. What in the world am I going to talk about? It was the time of the whales, and Mary Lane said to me, do something on Jonah. So I rather quickly threw together a kind of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim comparative look at early interpretations of the Jonah or Yunus story. And I remember when I gave this brief talk, when I came out, she turned to me and she said, you know, if you did 3 or 4 more of these things, you'd have a bestseller. Now, she was thinking of a bestseller of about 150 pages. And she might have been really right about that. So that's one myth of origin of how this book got started. She mentioned, how about Jonah? The other reality is that as a historian of religions, although I was trained in the early first 7 or 8 centuries of the history of Christianity, almost immediately upon completing my dissertation and beginning to teach, I decided to rename my field Religious Competition in the Ancient Mediterranean World. So for 20 years, I taught courses in which I looked at the interactions between Jews, pagans, and Christians. And finally, I got myself as a scholar and reader chronologically up to the 7th and 8th centuries. So I thought, let's just drop the pagans and talk about Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Why not that? So I started offering courses in that way and started doing these courses on how did these 3 different traditions take up some stories. There are 27 stories that occur in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, and the Quran. So you can start guessing which ones I decided not to do. But I chose 5 of these. And frankly, what I was really wanting to do is I wanted to discover what was the content and the nature of the first cultural contacts between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And in the first century, when you have a group, basically a Jewish sect called the Jesus followers, they're not named Christians till a little bit later. So that was an encounter from within Judaism. And so I worked on shared stories differently interpreted for each group's purposes. For Christians and Jews, up to about the 6th or 7th century. And then when Islam came on the scene, it becomes a trialogue. And I wanted to know, I decided, since all 3 of these groups describe themselves as book religions, why don't I find out whether I can gain any evidence that they knew about and discussed stories they have in common. And could I find in their own sources traces of clear evidence that they knew what the other 2 parties were doing to the same stories. So I need to say this again and again. In a strange sense, this study is not, it's based upon, but it's not about the form of the stories as they occur in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible and the Quran. It's about what Muslims, Jews, and Christians did with the stories as they continued to develop their religion and as they began to meet new and different historical circumstances and situations. It was pretty easy, and then it got quite deep in terms of how many resources were available to me. It was pretty easy to learn quickly that there was, in these exchanges, quite good comprehension by exegetes, interpreters of Scripture, was quite solid knowledge of what their competitors or their scriptural colleagues and interlocutors, they knew what each other were doing, and they could understand why, for example, the story of Cain and Abel needed to be told in a way that supported and moved ahead in interpretation of the first murder in Judaism. How a Christian interprets the same story might find a way to work in that narrative about first murder, themes about the murder of Christ, producing some anti-Jewish polemic along the way, and then a very different take on Cain and Abel in the Quran and then other commentators after that. And in the Quran, a lot of attention given to two issues. One of them, in what kind of situation is killing permissible? So it's moved from that story to Islamic law, as you could in Jewish law, about under what circumstances might someone be killed. Other interesting issue that came up in the Islamic materials, but also in the rabbinic writings, is why did God permit this young man, Cain, to murder his brother? Did God, by not preventing it, does that mean that it was destined and God stood with this action? Or what kind of agency does God allow to the people whose lives God is directing along the way? So that's just a kind of sample of the kinds of things that began to come up. And because I've long been fascinated by art and art history and used a lot of art in my teaching, I decided to also find the earliest instances of Jewish, Christian, and art that dealt with these stories. And lo and behold, as you know from going to museums, artists are just as enthusiastic interpreters of stories as writers are. So I was able to find a significant number of paintings and pieces of sculpted materials, gems with images in them, and was able to show in which those artists, whatever medium they were working in, were also serious interpreters of these stories. So let me give you just a little example. This is supposed to be a celebration in which we're standing up and talking to each other, so I don't want to be the only person talking, so I'm going to be brief. But think about Jonah. This is the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible. Observant Jews hear it read every year at Yom Kippur. So they're familiar with the story. If you read it, you would be reminded, I hope you'd be reminded, unless it's the first time, that Jonah is an irritated person from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. He tries to run away from God's providence so he can live without this sense of being ordered about by God. So he's rewarded by God sending a whale to swallow him up and test him a little bit in the belly. And when he comes out, he's still irritated, and he is sent, still pretty much against his will, to go to this nation, the Ninevites, and warn them that if they don't shape up in 40 days, they will be overthrown and destroyed. So he's a prophet. He has a huge investment in the accuracy of his own prophecy. And he's not terrifically clued in about how God might change things. So the Ninevites repent, and God saves them. And Jonah is really angry. He's ruined his reputation as a prophet. And to the end of the book, he sulks. So he's one of the prophets of God. So there has to be some repair of his reputation. I'll give you one example. There's a Jewish text that tells the story of a person named Rabbi Eliezer. A second story given to Jonah that might help his rep. He's in the fish. He directs the fish to go and confront the great Leviathan in the deep. And he comes up, next to Leviathan, and he says, I'm going to, at the end of days, I'm going to hook you, pull you up, slaughter you, and serve you as the main fish meal at the great resurrection day, in which all the people be judged will have the great messianic feast. So there he's doing the will of God, and it sounds like it's going to have a pretty positive outcome. So Jonah's looking better. Christians know the Jonah story. And one gospel writer who knows how Jewish interpretation works. He is interpreting a story in which people are demanding, both his friends and his enemies, are demanding that Jesus show them a sign of his power so that they can find him more compelling. And Jesus disappoints them all by saying, here's the sign I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you the sign of Jonah, which was his message, shape up or die. Matthew decides to insert into this saying of Jesus this statement. As Jonah went down into the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man went down into Jonah went down into the sea, into the depths. So did the Son of Man go down into the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. So he immediately likens Jesus' death and resurrection to Jonah's situation. And from then on, celebrates Jonah as the prototype of the coming Jesus. And basically, that move by Matthew's gospel, one sentence, shapes Jewish Christian interpretation of the Jonah retelling for a long, long time. The Jonah story is only kind of about the historic figure, prophet Jonah. It's really about Jesus' resurrection. One of the interesting things about this is that when Christians do this kind of typological interpretation in which they say this thing points to that, what they tend to do is leave the actual story of Jonah in the background and work all the Christian messages associated with it. So that's a strategy that you see and you bump into again and again. Very different thing from the Jewish interpretation. Quickly. In Islam, there's also this question of the reputation of Yunus, the prophet. And there is a saying attributed to, it's a hadith attributed to the prophet, in which he says, no one should think of it, no one should say that he himself is better than Yunus the prophet. No one should ever say he is better or more noble than Yunus the prophet. Which tells you what? Someone was saying that. So, while a prophet of God, a major class of God actors in Islam, he has a reputation for not being quite up to snuff in comparison with all the other prophets. So, what happens is that there's a lurking question back in the actual story. If you read the book of Jonah, while Jonah is in the fish, he offers a cry for help directed towards God. But in that cry of help, he never owns up to his fault in trying to run away from God. So rabbis comment on the fact that's kind of strange. Angels have to prompt him to say something. The angels have to prompt God to set him free. So in Islam, one of the things that happens is that when they tell the story, when the Quran tells the story, and when the later Muslim commentators tell the story, they have Jonah, Yunus, say from the belly, they call it the depths, the depth of the sea and the depth of the whale belly. He, during his confession from the belly of the whale, he says, I know that you are, let me get the formula right. I know that there is no God but you. I am blameworthy. I was a wrongdoer. And then the text goes on to say, if he had not prayed, if he had not prayed, he would have stayed in the guts of the whale until the judgment day. But as he did repent, he was released. So, you have so then, what begins to happen in the Islamic tradition is that Jonah becomes acknowledged as the one prophet, as the prophet who prayed better than all the other prophets. So remember where we started? So it's addressing a problem that's known from the Jewish tradition. It's passing by is not totally relevant. The Christian fascination with making Jonah into Jesus, but it's circling back to this question: who is he? This is a prophet of God, and what was his special trait? He knew how to say a version of the Shahada: there is no God but God. So he gave the straight, basic creedal statement of Islam. So that's that's a thread on the Jonah story in each of the three. I will say proudly and with some reservation that about 50 threads running through each of the stories are treated in this book. Why? Stories are never uninterpreted. There's no such thing as an uninterpreted story. The fact that something gets written down doesn't mean it didn't have an oral existence before it got written down. And people who are using these stories to organize their ritual life and their intellectual life and their theological life, they feel that it's perfectly natural to retell the story so that it addresses that community's new set of circumstances, including being in competition with two other peoples of the book. So that's what the book is about. I wrote it because I'm a historian of religions, and I've always been interested in where can you find evidence of how these groups first met each other and how they worked to distinguish themselves from each other. So the conclusion of the book, which I'm more prepared to say these are the obvious findings. If you read through the book, you won't be surprised when I state the thesis at the end. But there's a kind of previous thing. These stories are all told primarily to further and further develop each religion's own, can I say, agenda as a people of faith. So the stories get the twists and tweaks that they get in order to serve the purposes of that particular religion, its beliefs and its practices. And since these three religions have different beliefs and different practices, you won't be surprised to find that that's what happens. First purpose, use this story to add more content and more richness to our own religious community's sense of itself. And secondly, don't miss any opportunity to correct the people in the other two religions who are. So it's a double purpose all the way through. That's why you get all this evidence of knowledge of each other. What I conclude at the end of the book is that from the beginnings, interpreters of stories, teachers, writers of commentaries who take up a book word by word, preachers, teachers, artists, they play a much more important role than I think has been evident before my teasing all this stuff out. They play a much more crucial role than we think of in the formation, when I say the formation of each of those three religions. That is, they're working out, they are contributing to what defines us as over against the other two. And secondly, I think what's really important about this in the end is that in the process of preserving the story's usefulness to each group, the interpreters, artists, and writers are contributing to not only the self-definition of the three groups, but they're also contributing to the diversity that necessarily grows up between them. And these interpreters contribute a huge amount to the differentiation between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as they very quickly become discrete, independent religions. And I think that can be shown from before you get to the 10th century. So steady purpose. Now, I'm very aware of the fact that I chose to do this historical study at a time in which people are quite aware of religious strife. And it's fair to say that I did not have in my mind how different this world of interactions between religious groups is from what passes for religious discrimination and hostility in the modern world that we read about. It's a very intellectual and spiritual enterprise of honing your own religion while also defending yourself against slanderous, from your point of view, slanderous attacks on your own religion. But I have to say, as much as I'm concerned about modern politics, and as much as I spend more time than anyone should reading about contemporary politics, but I have friends in the room who do the same thing. I'm interested that some people are now seeing this, call this book timely. And immediately when I read that, I think, that's not what I had in mind. I'm a historian. I'm doing what I did. But some of the questions that are now getting discussed more broadly, you might have heard implied in my comments that by the time you go through Jewish interpretations of the story of Abraham's two women, Sarah and Hagar, and the Christian use of that same story, and the Muslim use of that story, you're not talking about the same Sarah and Hagar by the time you read these traditions, and you're not talking about the same Abraham. So I'm quite explicitly raising all kinds of questions about what people might mean when they talk about the Abrahamic religions, with a kind of supposition that they have a whale of a lot in common. I need to be clearer about that. I can't. So that happens to be the fallout of doing this kind of close textual analysis. I'm not unhappy with it because I'm a historian, and what comes out is all good. Say one other thing, just to wrap this up. One of the wildest aspects of this book is that I retired from teaching because I realized if I didn't retire, I would not be able to finish this book, because teaching, as everyone in this room might nod, is really time-consuming. And so I went into Green Library as a kind of monastic text and art student. And not to my surprise, because I've done it before, I was deliriously happy in my solitude. Most of you in this room actually were there for me to talk to when I came out. I really do appreciate it. One more tribute to Mary Lane. When the book was finished and had been sent off to Oxford, I still was having a hard time settling on just the right title. And I don't want you to picture this, but just think of it, register. For at least 6 months, every day when I stepped out of the shower, I had a new book title. And I would say to Mary Lane, how about this one? She said, keep thinking about it. Keep thinking about it. So one day I said, I got it. I'm not even going to talk about it. This is it. People have worried about the fact that rival tellings, that is, retellings of the story by people in all three religions, sound a little too pugilistic and antagonistic. And that may possibly be true, because they are working with the same stories, but what they're working to make them different in the communities in which they're being used. So I'm not removing that word from the title.